Hey there, I'm Ryan. Welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. And if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon along with the reference photo for color matching. If you're interested, check it out. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. Now, I am going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush because we are starting in the background and this is great for blocking in larger areas. That said, I am going to dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, and this is just going to help the paint stay wet for a longer period of time, though I do wipe off the excess because we want the brush to be damp, not wet. Now, here we have our three pigments. We have a Mars Black, a Titanium White, and an Ultramarine Blue. We are going to begin our mixture with quite a lot of said Titanium White. And as for the Mars Black, we only really want about 1/12 of that. Same goes for the Ultramarine Blue, or at least that's how I feel. I really want the backing mist here to be quite bright so that the trees in the foreground can be stark and really stand out. Though, if you'd like a more moody piece, you're more than welcome to work in quite a bit more blue or Mars Black. There's a lot of personal preference in there. But with that, I am going to start at the top left-hand corner and start working my way down. In terms of technique, I like to work with an X-shaped pattern for delivering a lot of paint because I'm able to move the pigment both horizontally and vertically at the same time. So it's a really quick way of getting that paint on there, which is something that is quite important when you're working in a large area with a medium like acrylics. Also, I'm covering up the majority of my drawing, really just trying to keep the base of the tree in there. But I always get asked the question, why do you go ahead and do the drawing if you're just going to cover it up? And I like to do the drawing initially because it does just give me an idea of where all my subjects are going to be and ensure that I am working towards something that I really like. I also redo the drawings a little bit later. But with that, we are going to work on the very subtle trees that you can see in the distance here. And I'm going to make mine a bit more stark, but I am starting with some Titanium White, about 1/8 that in Mars Black, and I'll also start with about 1/8 that in our Sap Green, first time we're using that. Now, with this, I'm going to go in for a little bit of a test on the reference photo. I can tell that it's a little bit more green than I like, so we're going to desaturate it. We add in a hint more of our Mars Black that will mix with the Titanium White in there and desaturate it, but then it becomes far too dark, so we incorporate some additional Titanium White to balance that out. And now you can see it is significantly less green and definitely getting towards what we want it to be. I'm also adding in that extra white to see if we can perfectly match what we have on the reference photo, and we actually get there. Though I do decide, you know what, let's make it a little bit darker just so it does stand out, and we can always go back and make it more subtle later on in the painting process should we want to. But now I'm going to switch over to the liner brush, and once this is a little bit damp, all of these bristles are going to condense into a really finite marking maker. And I love this brush for those details in the background, for details in the foreground, really everywhere. It's just such a fantastic brush. And right now we're going to be using it to render the trees in the top right hand corner, or rather the implication of them. They're very far away, they're going to be very small, we're not really going to see a lot of detail within there, but we will get the general shape. And something I am focusing on right now is ensuring that there's a lot of diversity in terms of the heights and the widths of all of these very vertical lines. So something I try to keep in mind is the amount of pressure I'm applying with the brush. If you apply a very minimal amount of pressure, you're not going to have many bristles press into the canvas. You might even just get paint on paint and therefore a very small marking. But if you apply more pressure, then your bristles will expand, the brush will get larger, and in turn you'll get a larger application. So you might want to start at the top of your vertical line, and not apply much pressure at all. And then as you continue to work your way down, apply more pressure, it'll build. And you can also do that from the top to create just larger trees in general. Though I am going back in once I have the majority of those vertical lines worked in, and I'm doing some taps on the side, trying to create some branches that stick out. These ones are going to be fairly large because again, we're so far away that we're only going to see those larger branches. And it's also worth noting that you can start to create some fake depth by just making your mixtures for the tops of the trees and the branches a little bit more watery, as the water will make the pigment more transparent. You'll get more of that mist showing through. So it'll look like the mist is working its way over the trees. And often when you look at trees in fog in the distance, it's the larger areas, it's the bases that are going to have more of a darker value, where the tops, because there's just more mist to surround it, it isn't as much mass. You're going to see it a little bit differently. So just different things to consider. It's perhaps overthinking such a simple area, but we don't want to incorporate a lot of detail in this area so it doesn't take away from the foreground. So we look for little things like that to ensure that it's nice and realistic while not relying on detail. Now, I'd also like to note here that I am going back, I'm adding extra trees, and I'm really trying to have fun with it. Just start warming up. This is our first real subject in the painting, so we have an opportunity to kind of get that shake out of our hand, ensure that we're focusing in, getting it all working. And I think this is a great subject to do that with, especially because later on, if we don't love it, we can cover it up, or different portions of it, with additional fog. So do keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does have to be relatively simple, and each area has to be somewhat unique. Now, once I get the majority of the tops applied, I'm going to start working my way down with more of that pigment, significantly more. And while we started with vertical, I am going to eventually start switching to more of a horizontal, but I want a larger body of trees to be shown through the mist. We're not really going to see much detail. And now I'm grabbing some extra water on my brush, wiping off the excess. That way it's not too watery, but it's more watery than it was before. And that's going to help me blend my wet pigment into my dry pigment, which you see just under it. So this is called a wet into dry blend. And often when we think of painting, we think of wet into wet, but you can blend wet into dry, as we just let that green tree color kind of dissipate as it moves on top of the mist. And we're working in a circular stroke with the brush. You can see it kind of moving almost visually frantically, though it is all very intentional, and the strokes are refined to the point where we are aiming to get something that has a soft movement down into the fog. We will be going back later on, by the way, and adding additional fog, working its way up to further soften it. So you are going to have areas that are going to look a little bit rough. Don't worry about that. We will have opportunities to fix that, many later on. So right now we're trying to get the general idea, and then I have this other spot of green that's slightly below our set of trees there, just to show that maybe more fog is moving over different areas, kind of separating it. It's just going to make it look a little bit more interesting, but again, in a very simplified way, which is really what we're attempting to achieve in the background. And here you can see I'm splashing in some additional smaller trees. I'm not going to completely fill it, but it is going to help. And then I just kind of dive back and forth between the blending process, which you see here, and adding in those trees until I find the balance that I really want. And I would recommend taking 5 or 6 steps back from the canvas when you feel like you're done. That way you can see what it'll really look like when you look at it on a wall, rather than being 2 feet in front of it like when we're going through the actual painting process. Now, speaking of being a little bit farther away, I am going to peel back the camera, and we're going to start working on a secondary area right down here. Now, there are going to be quite a few areas of showing trees through the fog on kind of this similar trajectory, working their way down, but I'm not going to create an entire line of it. I do want to imply that some areas of land are maybe a little bit lower, and some just do get lost under that mist, which is a little bit more inconsistent. So this is what it again looks like from a bit farther away. And it's important that you do look at your canvas from varying distances, because as I just mentioned, when someone looks at a painting for the first time, and when you are looking at it, the majority of the time, you're probably not going to be too close to it. And so taking those steps back is a much better way of really realizing how it's all going to look. Another general tip I'd love to give you is consider the lighting in your painting space. When I was in high school and I was just learning to paint, I did this painting one night with these really warm bulbs in my room. And so I thought I was using a lot of warm blues and warm greens, and I was really happy with just the general atmosphere of it. But then when I took it outside the next morning and I saw it under natural light, it looked like a completely different painting. Everything was so fresh and vibrant, and I really loved it there, but it wasn't what I thought I was working on. So definitely something to consider, especially when you're working on this mist. Do consider the amount of light in your space. If you're working with natural light, if your bulbs are a little bit cooler or warmer, something that not all of us think of, and generally not immediately. So do consider it. I've now been painting for 15 years, I think, and I feel like lighting is something that I very much appreciate. And once you have lighting that you like, it's really hard to work in anything else. So do consider that. I am currently working in natural light, though, because I do find that it's just a very general, good, accurate representation, provided it isn't too blue or cloudy out. That said, here I am working on another really small area, and you can tell that each patch of trees is going to be a different size. When I was talking about wanting each individual tree to be different than the one from beside it, I also want the larger clusters to also have that general idea. So I work that top in, I work the pigment down, and we go for that larger blend, which is done with significantly more water, those circular strokes. And I think that it's all working really, really nice at this point. We're going to have these really large trees in the foreground, which are going to work over these to a point, but it's great to have these in the background being subtle, adding to the general atmosphere, giving us that depth. And again, I'm really happy with what we've done. Though with that, you can see that there's another one right down towards the left, and it leads into the middle ground where we do have some larger, more sizable trees. So that's what we're going to start working on. And with this, I'd recommend starting to maybe make your trees a little bit bigger. I do start by making mine in the same general size as the first ones, and then I slowly extend them. And that's normally how I like to paint. If I need to change a pigment's color, I do so very gradually, adding little bits. That way it's easy to walk back if we need to. And I do the same when I'm actually crafting my subjects. So I started with those smaller ones at the top, and then as we got a bit closer to us, I'm like, okay, maybe we'll try a medium-sized one, maybe a slightly larger one. And that's generally, in my opinion, the best way of going about it. It's nothing too large, too rash, and you can kind of gauge your level of success and your happiness with it as you do make those subtle tweaks. You're also starting from a place that you were just working, and therefore that newer subject is more comfortable and less daunting, which I think is also really important for a lot of painters. I think we've all been in a point where we are working on a painting, we love a painting, but then we get hit with a certain point and it's, I don't know how to do that, I'm going to put it down. And then, the week that you intended to put it down for turns into a month, maybe 2 months, maybe 3 months, maybe a season. And again, we've all been through it. So working from a place of familiarity, I think, can be really beneficial. And that's something I'm trying to keep in mind here. But I do continue to work that green down once I have those tops in there. And this is actually going to move down significantly more than any of the others because, again, we are getting closer to us. Our trees are going to be larger because of perspective. And so are the kind of clusters and chunks of trees as well. Though I go for that blend effect, and while it's more than anywhere else, I am going to want to extend it, but I want to live with it for a second. So I decided to add a couple more trees to the left, give me some time to digest it a little bit, and then really decide how much farther we want to continue bringing it down. I do check the reference photo quite frequently just to ensure that I am on track. But here, when we pull back, you can see just the disparity in size between the newer cluster of trees and the ones that we have up. You can also see the trajectory and the transition of the larger trees to the smaller trees as we get higher up in the painting. So much perspective when you do take those steps back. And I know that normally when we do these lessons, I try to talk in real time as I'm doing the actual painting, but it was a rather loud day. So I figured that, we do a dub. And in this, I could also talk about some of the larger topics of painting as well, and give you some additional instruction, because quite a bit of this is a bit more repetitive. It's a bit more of a simple piece, so we're not jumping through hundreds of subjects. We're working for a longer period of time on a couple of them. So, we can also interject some conversation about general painting technique, lighting, pressure, all of that good stuff. But now we are going back to the mix, and I'm going to grab about an even mixture of all of my pigments with the exception of our blue. And right now I want to create more of what we have here for the foreground, though it definitely needs to be darker. We want the initial base color, not the mid value, though we will go for the mid value a little bit later. So right now I'm looking for something that matches the shadowy hues. So once we have that, I switch back to the liner brush, and we are going to begin at the tops of our trees, just like we did in the background. However, I start with a very, very tiny marking, which then starts to have these branches that start to work out on the left and the right hand side. We've done this to a very tiny extent, but this is really getting to the proper level of detail. So while in the past, while things were implied, right now we are painting the actual branches, the actual foliage. We are close enough that we will see them to some extent. We won't see all of them, but we will see significantly more. So I'm going to be significantly more meticulous. I might take my time, and I also I want to ensure that I have a nice thick application, especially as we move into the middle ground and the foreground. One of the things that I always find when people have been painting for a longer period of time, often they do opt to use significantly more paint, where when you're just getting started, you're a bit more hesitant. You just purchase all of this paint. You don't want to use it all up too quickly. So I think that generally seeing those more thick layers is a great indicator that someone does really know their way around the medium. And so I am trying to ensure that at least the primary body of these trees has a good amount of paint. The applications towards the left and right might be a little bit more transparent, and therefore you get more of that natural green showing through. The more semi-transparent it is, the more watered down it is, the more green you will see showing through, where when the paint is thick it'll be darker. So that's also something you can do to play with depth a little bit, but make sure that the body of your tree, the majority of that foliage and in the more thick areas, make sure that it is nice and thick. And if you accidentally have a little bit too much water, you're finding it difficult to apply that paint, just let it dry fully and then come back to it. It'll make it significantly more easy to work with, and you will get the application that you really want. Sometimes you just need a little bit more patience. Though here we are working on 2 more trees. They all have slightly different heights. It's not by much, but it is a little bit. You can also tell that they're not equally spaced out. That was intentional. And my brush strokes here are very loose. I'm kind of playing with it in a cathartic fashion. I do want the general movements, and I can always go back and work meticulously with it, but working loosely and from more of a distance is generally a great way of just ensuring that you're not going to end up with the same strokes in general. And then once I have the majority of that worked in, I go back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush and we work on the bottom of those trees, really filling that in, because realistically it would take quite some time if we were to continuously use that liner brush. So that 1-inch brush yet again coming in handy, and I'm going to continue using this to block in the other mid-ground trees, or at least the implication of them, because as we move towards the right, there's going to be significantly more fog working on top, so we don't actually have to paint trees. We just need to paint the implication of them, and even less so form-wise than what we did in the background. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to make the base of this bottom tree area, which is essentially wrapping around the foliage which we'll see in the foreground, and I want that bottom area to be nice and thick. However, when moving up, try to get something that's much more soft. And when my hand moves, you'll see that I don't have a hard line at the top of any of these greens. It's much more of a gradient, and it's a very chalky gradient. You can see a lot of tooth in the canvas. It's very messy looking, doesn't look good at all. I recognize that. It's okay. It is part of the process. And when you're working with acrylics, because there's a lot of layering involved, you will often find areas of the painting that just don't look great, but it is okay. Just trust the process. We'll get it there. It is meant to look this way. Don't get discouraged. But I am now going to take the liner brush and just paint in the implication of a couple of trees poking out from there. That way you do get the general shape. And after that, I am going to grab some additional titanium white, work that in with what we were using, and I'll use this to craft some more subtle trees right behind this general area. And these are still going to be relatively large, at least to the same level of what we had over on the left-hand side, though significantly less dark because they are slightly farther away, and we just have more mist over this area. So this is a really good extra thing to do while the other area is drying. We are going to add a lot of mist on top of that green that we were just applying that is very toothy right now. But while we wait for that to dry, we are going to start working in these additional trees to give us some extra depth. And I will work them in over on the left-hand side as well, in between some of the more stark pieces. And realistically, for layering, generally you want to work the background first, then the midground, and the foreground. That way you're always working on top. Here it's kind of awkward because we're working a midground subject that is behind our other mid-ground subjects on top of them. But so we're just kind of trying to work around the edges for the most part, but you can always go back in with more stark and work it on top of the slightly more muted version. And I'll also throw another one in right beside it, of course, with a very different height. And it is good to also use a bit of water in this. That way it's a bit softer looking. But with that, I am also going to now go for a bit more of that green, but on a larger scale with the 1-inch flat-headed brush. That way we can continue the idea that there are trees in the midground that are covered in mist, and then there are trees in the midground that aren't so much. So this is going to be the ones that are, and it, like that first application, is going to be very subtle. It's going to have so much mist on it that you're not really going to be able to see the actual definition or definitive outline of trees. We will work in some subtle branches, but I'm also going to be very loose with my brush strokes, and I'm doing that purposefully so that we have this subtle implication of movement within trees. We won't actually see the detail, but we can see the implication of it, and often implication is just so important in our paintings, especially when we want to create a lot of depth. Though much like the previous darker layer, we want that top to not be a hard sharp line. I'm trying to get as much of a gradient with it as I can and just create something soft, because it'll make the application of the actual mist and fog so much easier to apply. So that is something I'm keeping in mind. But then I also switch back to the liner brush, grab that same green that we were just working with, and I'll create some mid-value highlights. So nothing actually too bright, but it's bright in relation to what we're applying it on. And we're just applying some extra branches. That way, when some areas of the fog are less opaque, when we get to see through them, we do get to see, oh, there are trees behind there, and we get to build that illusion of depth without having to go through the process of really painting in dozens of perfect trees, right? So it's looking awkward right now, but it's saving us a lot of time, and it really will end up turning out great. So again, trust the process. I know it looks messy. It is okay. We are going to be switching to a round-headed brush, and I want this because the edges are great for blending because they aren't sharp, and we are going to start reincorporating some mist to start tidying things up. And you can see how the mist works its way over top all of those implied greens and trees. Now for this, I'm going to grab a lot of titanium white, maybe again 1/12 that Mars black, 1/12 that in our ultramarine blue. Make sure that your water is completely clean. That way it doesn't accidentally pick up any green, and make sure that the greens on the canvas have fully dried before you go ahead and do this. Maybe take a tea break, have a little snack, make sure to keep hydrated and all of that. So easy to start painting and then just forget about everything else. But here you can see I'm working my brush in a circular shape, and I'm slowly moving down from the actual mist. The idea here is that we start at the top and then we let it dissipate as we move over the greens, and we can do that on the farther set of trees that we have as well. So this is something that isn't just specific to the foreground. You can work it in the background if you feel like you had a little bit of a hard line with the really distant trees, or if you just want to soften them. If you feel that they're a little bit too stark, you can work that in there. And I'm also going to work this over some of the other trees in the midground, predominantly though the bottom portions, that way they can stick up and you get that, again, extra little bit of depth. Though here we are continuously going back to that palette, grabbing more, and by not creating a hard edge with our greens, this is going on so much better. The paint is still semi-transparent, so if there was a hard line, you'd still be able to see it through numerous layers. And because we don't have that, we're able to get this transition to a much more, professional degree. And it still looks fairly awkward, would like to preface that, but with a lot of layers and some patience, it does happen. So here we are continuing, and I like to move a lot of my paint upwards into the areas that are already very misty, just to get that paint off the brush. So when I move down to this bottom area, or the areas that need to overlap green, I move a little bits at a time, and it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, working very minimally whenever possible so that I can gauge things and make little tweaks, ensure that we're just doing it all right. So here, continuing to do that, and this is something that I think we're all going to have a slightly different preference for, how much mist is perfect for these areas. Make sure that you have a lot over the top so that you have that really nice transition, but then as you get towards the bottom and more of that mid-ground foreground area, you don't have to do as much. Really depends on you and your personal preference. You can see that with me, it's dissipating as it gets closer and closer to us. I like that a lot. Here I added a bit of extra water to my brush, and you can see that in the actual applications, and that they are a bit more semi-transparent there. And that'll also allow me to work entirely over those trees on the right hand side without it completely taking them out and giving us that same mist that we have in the background. It's not too opaque. By the way, titanium white is inherently quite an opaque pigment, quite thick. You can get something like a zinc white, which will be significantly less thick, great for things like this actually, but the properties in it aren't necessarily the most healthy, which is why I personally stick with the titanium white. It's a little bit harder to use when doing glazing and things like this, but you can still get a great technique and great effect in the end. So that's what we're doing here. And as you can see, I'm continuing to build, and I think that it looks better and better as I do. We still have that gradient. It still moves from that mist pigment at the top into something that is more so green and dark at the bottom, but the more we do, the better it looks, and you just want to ensure that you do still keep a little bit of that gradient, though again, personal preferences there. And I added quite a bit more water to my brush. It ripped off a little bit of paint. I get asked the question, does water rip off the paint? Only if the paint is still very wet. And I actually like this though. I think that it adds a unique little open spot in it where you can still see a bit more of the tree. So I actually decided to keep it. If you find that happens and you don't like it, very easy to fix. Let it dry 5 to 10 minutes, fully dry, and then go back in and add paint with slightly less water. It'll go great. And here you can see that I'm using quite a bit of water to work my way over some of those trees on the left hand side, and just further differentiating different almost silhouetted trees at this point, because everything in the foreground is, I say foreground, right now it's the foreground, it's still really the middle ground, but right now it's all kind of on the same level, and we can use the mist to separate it by adding varying amounts of mist to varying subjects. And I think that it's actually turning out really, really well here. So continuing to dabble, I would also recommend taking little breaks through this process, coming back in, but removing yourself so you can see, do I have too much? Do I have too little? Where might I want to add a little bit more? And if you're taking it slow like I am and just applying it in minimal amounts, you'll be able to ask that question before you feel like you kind of overdo a section or two. So also just another thing to consider. Here we are up very close. I'm grabbing that liner brush, equal mixture of the sap green, Mars black, a bit more titanium white than the other two because I do want it to be a bit brighter, and the other two are just inherently stronger pigments. Though you can see that I'm continuously going back and I'm trying to find a mid to darker green here to reincorporate some of the details that we lost when we were adding that mist and there's other trees. And this is just to ensure that it looks like these are in fact over top a lot of the mist and the trees that we have right behind them. Remember, we were talking about how it can be awkward when you're layering subjects behind other subjects just because the edges don't always look correct. This is how we go back and we actually correct that. We just pick the subject that is closest to us and we reincorporate those applications over top of it a little bit. I'm also going to use this to incorporate some other implied trees in the background, just in areas that did stay a bit darker, stay a bit more opaque, didn't have as much of that mist in there. And if your mist is still semi-wet, this will actually blend really nicely and you'll get something soft and subtle. So don't worry about waiting for that to dry in this part of the process. There are areas where you do need to let it dry, like the last. Before we added that mist, everything needed to be perfectly dry for that to work out. But here we don't have to take that break or wait that period of time. It's really just continue with the painting process and having fun with it. Here we are continuing to move it down with the liner brush, and I have to say, we've painted a lot of trees, but I still love them. I really, really enjoy painting the subject, and I hope that you also find that kind of creative fulfillment in creating the same subject, but different every single time and trying to balance them all. With that, here we are going back to our 1-inch brush, and we're going to actually start working on the tree trunks. So I have some Mars Black and for the very first time an equal amount of burnt umber, and here I'm also going to grab a really small hint of titanium white just to desaturate the burnt umber a little bit. I'm going for the darkest pigment within the tree trunk, so I really like what we end up mixing, and I go in with the damp 1-inch brush, and for the actual application, as you can see, I go in for a little bit of a tap at the top. That way, there's no pressure with the brush. It's just pigment on canvas, and therefore I get the smallest marking. But as I move my way downwards, I apply pressure and I incorporate a little bit of a drag. So you can see that the top of the tree, very sharp, very small, as it comes down, it does expand, it gets larger, and that's all just done through pressure with the brush. Very, very simple. You can try it on a practice canvas if you haven't done this before. The actual edge of the brush is significantly larger than the top of the tree, and so I'm just kind of using the edge of the brush to get that. I'm not pressing the face of the brush into the canvas. It's really just the sharper edge, and then we do get the entirety of the face as we move down and we progressively work that. Though here I am taking the general idea of varying size trees and continuing that. I look over the reference photo, I see, okay, you know what, these all have different heights, and you can also see that I've redrawn in my foliage very, very subtly with woodless colored pencils, and I like those because they're erasable and I can also take them off with water. But again, if you'd like help with that drawing process and just figuring out where all of that foliage, the traceable, is up over on Patreon. Great way to support the channel, but you also don't need it. You are more than welcome to have fun and just kind of make it your own. Here I'm getting a lot closer, still using that liner brush that we had before, and I'm starting to work in some of our branches. The branches should be the largest when they are connecting to the middle of the tree, though the branches should never be larger than the area of the tree which they are connecting to. I'm going to apply them to both sides. Every branch should be different, different. And I also like to do little extra pieces of the branches that are breaking off and, doing their own thing. We are going to apply a lot of foliage over top of these. Most of them will not be visible at the end of this, but we do want to give us a good amount of variety. And I'm also trying to consider where the branches are, not only going up and down, but left and right. I don't really ever, I say ever, most of the time, I don't want there to be a branch on both the left and right hand side equally. That can often look a little cartoonish, a little awkward. So I do try to stagger it, kind of work them in between each other. And it's not just like one on the left and then one on the right, and then a little bit farther down, one on the left, a little bit farther down, one on the right. Sometimes it's two, sometimes it's three, and then one to the other side. And just trying to get that diversity. You can also see my pinky finger on the canvas, and that's just to eliminate any shake in my hand at that point. Again, when a lot of us are painting, general painting conversation, we can get so into it. I know I am that way. I can paint for hours and hours and just the day fades away. But it's really important that you stay hydrated and that you do get a bite to eat here and there. I know that when I do not, my hand gets a lot more shaky when you're trying to do branches like this. That is very difficult. So friendly reminder to take those breaks. There are going to be plenty of opportunities where you're waiting for things to dry. Make good use of that time and do ensure that you are staying healthy in the painting process. I think it's really important. But here I have some branches which are actually overlapping other branches, and that's another great piece of depth in something that still doesn't have a gradient or any actual light wrapping around, making it three-dimensional, right? We're making it three-dimensional simply through the silhouetted pigment that we're applying. There is another example. When I'm at the top of the tree, I do want my branches to be more sparse, so I'm not going to be doing as many, and they should progressively get longer as we continue to move down the actual tree. Though once we apply the foliage, we're going to have a much better idea of where a lot of the branches actually need to be. So we are going to go back and do more, which means that in this process, you don't have to do too many. Here, they're also a little bit watery. If you find that that occurs, I would recommend going over it a little bit later once it dries with a secondary layer. You do want them to look nice and thick and professional. But here we have a bit of a wider shot. Yet again, very important to look at the painting up close and far away, trying to find different ways of working some branches over others while not overdoing it and making it too predictable. And here you can see that the branches aren't just a singular line and then another one. Sometimes it's two or three. And I also really like to have fun with these in that they're the sizing's also different. I don't always want all of the branches to be the same level of thickness. So much like with the actual trunk of the tree, we want to vary the amount of pressure that we have going on within them. Here we're working on the one slightly more to the left, and we are eventually going to have overlapping branches at the bottom. I do want you to kind of prepare yourself for that. It might look a little bit messy initially, but when we get the foliage in there, it will look great. Though I do want them to look like two distinctly different trees. So especially at the top and in the middle, I am not going to have the branches cross over with the ones that are over on the right. And also don't ever feel like you have to perfectly balance the branches. When I was looking at the reference photo, and when you look at trees like this in general, you probably find that there actually isn't an equal amount of foliage or branches on both sides. That often it is a little bit more one-sided, and that is going to aid you in making something more realistic. So do try to keep that in the back of your head as well. I am going to jump over to the other top of our tree just while we're kind of in the practice of it, making branches this general size and staggering it in the way that we do. And I am getting quicker at it as we continue to progress. I am trying to also keep it a bit more loose if I can. I try to keep my physical body a bit farther back. That way I don't have complete control, which is important. And when I am creating these branches, I'm not trying to create a bunch of soft looking branches. So it's not a bunch of smooth movements within it. Sometimes I do go for a jagged edge or a sharper turn, and I really think that helps sell it as an actual branch. And it's about finding that balance between that and then the smoother movements as well. So really do consider that when you're working on yours. It shouldn't be one or the other. Generally, it should be both. Sometimes you have a smooth bend, sometimes you have a hard almost looking like a break, though it's connected, so it's not actually broken. I'm also going to skip a larger middle section here in the tree and then do a couple farther down, and that's another great thing to keep in the back of your head. In the same way that both sides don't have to be completely even, you don't even amount going down the tree. Sometimes you are just going to have larger open pockets that don't have as much foliage, and that is also going to really aid you in creating something nice and realistic. Also, don't forget to go back and add additional layers to anything that might be a little bit watered down. My mixture right now is relatively watery because that water is going to help condense the bristles and help me get a finer or sharper application, though it does come at the cost of thin paint. So something to consider. Now, I do want to add the mid values into the tree so that we get some texture. I'm going to grab some of our burnt umber, about half that in our Mars black, if not less. Then I'll grab an equal amount of titanium white to the burnt umber, and we're going to start creating something that's a bit more earthy, though still very desaturated. There's a lot of titanium white and Mars black in this for that reason. I go in for a tap. It's pretty much a perfect match with the mid values, but then I also want highlights, so I move a little bit of it off to the side, grab some titanium white, and that right there is also pretty perfect. So I have two different colors. I'm going to start with the darker one, and when I apply this, you're going to notice that it isn't as visually bright as what we had on the reference photo when we were matching, and that's because we are applying this over a very dark pigment. Acrylics are semi-transparent, and therefore that darker pigment will show through our pigment. So another good lesson, your paints on the palette are not always exactly what they're going to be on the canvas, because on the canvas it is a mixture of that and whatever's under it, even if whatever's under it is fully dry, just because of how acrylics are semi-transparent unless you really build up those layers. So you might want to overcompensate, make it a little bit brighter when you are working on a darker background. Though I really love working subtly, so I continued with this, and then we do build it up later with something a little bit brighter. You can see that mine has fully dried though, so I'm just going to remix up a bit more of it. And now when I go in for this, you can see that there is that little bit of texture. It gives it that nice pop, that nice bit of bark, but it's very subtle. And it's also worth noting that you can add more brightness to this if you'd like. I go over a couple of areas, but you do still want that initial darker pigment to show through. That way you do get that contrast. But the name of the game is subtlety. And then from there, we are going to work on the base layer of our foliage. For the mix, I am still going to be using the 1-inch flat-headed brush. Going to grab quite a lot of our sap green to begin with, about an even mixture of our Mars black. And of course, we do want to desaturated, so we're also going to grab a little bit of titanium white, maybe about 1/8 our current mixture, and then I do decide to continue darkening it with some additional Mars black, and that right there is pretty good. So we go in for the test. It's a little bit darker than what we have on all of the trees, but I'm actually quite happy. And now we're going to switch to the fan brush, and this is a soft fan brush, so when it gets a little bit of water on it, the bristles are going to split up into 7 or 8 different little clusters, and you can see that here. This is really great for actually applying pigment because it'll make 7 or 8 markings should we want them, but it's also going to randomize them, which is really nice when working on foliage. Now, there are a couple of ways of going in and doing this foliage. You could meticulously draw it out with something like a liner brush, or you can do it in a bit more of a randomized manner like this and then refine it later with the liner brush, which is what I personally opt to do. And I go about it in this way so that I do continuously get that randomization and I don't accidentally create areas that are very similar and therefore cartoony. Realistically, if you just followed the reference photo or the traceable perfectly, you wouldn't run into that issue, as you always do see the natural evolution. But if you're working from your mind, or this is just a generally great technique to work with for you to have kind of within your pocket, so you can ensure that even when you don't have a perfect visualization of something, you can still make it look natural. Anyways, we are looking for the larger clusters, and I am looking over to my reference photo to find out roughly where they are. I also have my drawing on the canvas, which again is very subtle, but there to help. And I'm just trying to find those larger clusters. I apply more taps in the more dense areas, and then we end up with these randomized markings all around it, which are great to work with that general movement. You can tell that I'm not always applying the entirety of the brush to the canvas at that time. I'm doing a lot of rotations. I'm working with maybe a quarter of the brush, maybe a third of the brush. So we don't always have to utilize the entirety of it, and that is important because most fan brushes are relatively large, and if we use the entirety of them, we get a very spread out marking, which isn't something that I'm really looking for right now. I'm looking for general shapes that I see within the reference photo that I can work around my branches, and so that isn't something that I'm too interested in doing right now, again using the entirety of that brush. But here you can also see the difference between the applications when I have a bit more water on the brush and when I don't. Up top there is significantly more pigment, but that area that's a little bit farther down, you can see it's a bit more green. That was done with more water, and that's a great example of how water can be great, as it will condense those bristles on that softer fan brush, but also how it will require additional layers later on. Though, as I noted, we are going to go in and refine all of this and really give it a lot of shape and form, weight with our branches when we go in with the liner brush a little bit later on. So it really isn't any worry in it, much like the greenery initially down below. It's going to look a little awkward for a period of time, but it is meant to, so don't get discouraged. It is okay. And I actually think that's quite a nice start. You can see different patches of foliage. It looks unique. It looks interesting. We're now going to move over to the larger tree in the middle. And it's worth noting that I actually wouldn't recommend starting with the middle tree. We started with the one on the right, and I think that was the correct call, in that it is our first time, at least in this painting, working with this type of subject, working with this randomized application. And yes, you can try it on another canvas first, and that's actually a great idea, but you want to ensure that you're not starting in the center, in the main focus. That way, if it takes a little while to warm up, you do have that opportunity to warm up before you work on the area that is really going to capture a lot of people's attention, where the eye is going to stay for the most part, right? The left and the right hand trees are similar sizes, but the one in the center is really what's going to capture the most attention. So I would recommend starting with either the left or the right hand tree, and that's a general rule. We work up to our main subject, and I do feel quite good, quite confident here, so I am starting to work in that middle area. Alternatively, we could have worked on the tree over on the left hand side and then moved to this. But I also find with foliage and different subjects, sometimes I get the hang of it and I'm really excited about it, and then I continue to work my way through it, where eventually you might find yourself a little bit distracted, you might find yourself hungry, you might kind of feel yourself being pulled in different directions. So I thought I would strike here in the middle when I was feeling really excited about doing so, and I'd recommend considering that in your mood when you are picking different subjects, especially when you have as much option and variety as we do here within our multiple trees. But here, still trying to keep that general idea of clusters. Admittedly, I do think this is looking quite messy in comparison to what we have over on the right hand side, but we are going to fix it up with a liner brush, and I'm also going to show you how to work reductively. So if there are some randomized applications that you don't end up liking, we can take those out and ensure that we end up with something still really, really aesthetic. The bottom area definitely needs a lot of work in that middle tree, and so I actually decided to take a little little bit of a break from it, so I can kind of watch it on the corner of my eye, consider how I want to move forward with it. Sometimes if you find an area is particularly just not working the way you want, you do take those breaks and you can come back to it with much better, more complete perspective on how it should be done. So that's really what I'm doing at this point, and I think that the left hand side is actually going really quite well. So that break is working out. It wasn't that I was particularly burnt out on working on this foliage. It was just that that particular area I was somewhat uninspired, which might sound funny because we are working from a reference photo and a traceable, but I felt like the applications just weren't going on in a way that I loved. And so we just moved over and things are going quite well over here. Still trying to leave some of those branches to show through, though we can always reincorporate additional branches. And now that I'm more so happy with the applications, I'm going back over what we had over in that bottom center area, going over the areas that were a little bit too semi-transparent, though we will have to continue cleaning that up with more refined brushes and options a little bit later on. Though things are definitely starting to work out, and you can tell that I'm also overlapping my branches through this singular area. I do like that. I feel like it does give it that extra element of depth, and when we do add additional greens, we can continue building on that depth and showing that one of the trees is in fact in front of the other. So with that, we are now going to switch over to our liner brush right here. I'm going to grab the pigment that we've been working with, and I'll start to craft additional branches and add form to a lot of these randomized applications. Start to connect the ones that are connected to branches or other foliage, and really start to develop more of a synergy and a rhythmic system to the movement in all of this. Now, it's going to take a little while, but it really is a fun process, and I definitely think it was probably part of my favorite part of this tree process here. Just in terms of application freedom, we already have this very loose structure, but it's also kind of, connect the dots while also reintroducing forms, and it really is a lot of fun. That said, here you can see that I'm going in and I'm starting at the top because I do feel that the top is really quite necessary to look great, and I wanted to go in while I had all of these fresh ideas where nothing felt overdone. I feel like we can kind of get away with a little bit more in the body of the tree and towards the bottom, but this top area, there isn't going to be a lot of foliage, right? There's certainly less towards the top, and so rather, that which we do has to turn out much better because it is so much more singular and noticeable. So here you can see that we are taking our time. I'm just grabbing a little bit more water, heading back to the palette. And once I have the majority of that done, I do start to move down towards that middle section. And here, I think it's important that we create larger clusters, but we also remember that there needs to be openings. And the farther we get to the edges of the tree, the more openings I'm going to have, because realistically, there's going to be less foliage and branches there. We have a lot more close to the middle, close to that body. The branches themselves are physically larger, but as we move farther and farther out, we definitely find those openings. So it's something I'm trying to keep in mind, but it's a rule that I'm not holding on too tightly to the point where it's very noticeable. So I'm working with it in subtle ways. You can see that I'm also now moving over to the right-hand side of the canvas and balancing that out as well. We started on the left-hand side because it was just working really well hand positioning wise, the way my body was around the canvas. And you might find that as you move from side of the tree to the other side, that you might have to move yourself around. And because we're working with such a dark pigment, there's a lot of Mars black in this. It might be very reflective when wet, so you might actually just find it beneficial to occasionally move around your canvas and ensure that you're not getting a bunch of glare or something that it's making it difficult to kind of read the darker values or where your pigments actually are. That can actually be a little bit of a tricky thing, though as it dries it will become less reflective and you won't have to deal with that. But here we are heading back up to the top of the left hand side of our tree. This one definitely needs significantly less work than the middle tree. So kind of funny considering this is where we had our practice, but that does end up happening occasionally. And I was just really, really pleased with this tree over here on the right hand side. Though I really wanted to go back to it with the liner brush, because if we did that with the middle tree and the one over on the left, then the one on the right would look really probably too different. Realistically, we keep talking about the necessary amount of diversity, but there probably would be a little too much there if we simply didn't use the liner brush on that right hand tree. The techniques would just vary too dramatically and it would be noticeable. So we are finding different little areas. I'm also going to use this to incorporate some additional branches. Will the branches be a bit more green rather than the earthy tone that we have in the body? Yes, but maybe they're a little bit mossy, or maybe they have a little bit of that, reflective green from all of the foliage that surrounds them. Realistically, I don't think it'll be too noticeable or an issue. But if you do have any large branches, you can add on the extra browns with the burnt umber and try to make it look a bit more textured, though none of mine ended up being that size. And in fact, you can really tell how small they are with this right hand tree, especially with the one that's right under my brush there. So having a lot of fun with just kind of working all of this out. The one on the left now looking significantly more awkward. But while we're going ahead and fine tuning all of these, when we kind of stop hyper focusing on all of the individual branches and we visually take a step back, it is worth noting that these trees ended up being a bit larger than my drawing, than my traceable, than the reference photo. And because of that, they look closer to us and they are a bit more dominant, which is something that you might like, you might not like. I personally feel like it's a little too dominant. And so I am going to make these trees smaller. I'm going to take away foliage. We are going to work reductively. We're not going to do that yet. It is a little bit later in the lesson, but I wanted to point it out now. If you feel like through this process of adding extra branches that you're adding too much, that it's just kind of taking up more space than you want it to, that you can't see the fog anymore, don't worry about it. We do have a process to work backwards and remedy that, and I will be showing you that a little bit later in the lesson. Also, you could be a little bit less loose than I was with the fan brush in the actual application, really following the traceable and reference photo. And I know I've brought them up a bunch of times. You don't actually need them. I'd like to hyper stress that. They are there to act as aids, as guides to help you should you feel like you'd like it to get it to that extra level of realism, but in no way are they necessary. That said, they are again up over on Patreon. The support up there is always very much appreciated. This is a community funded show, and that's how we do it. So if you'd like to support the channel, if you'd like the reference photos, the traceables, my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially just the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. All of the other ebooks full of traceables, our exclusive Facebook group where everybody posts their work, and we get to see different versions of the same lessons, which is always really fun because you get different ideas for different things. But if any of that interests you, there's a link in the description to the Patreon. Always very much appreciated if you can support the channel, but if you can't, also totally understand it, and you also don't need to work with the reference photos or the traceables. I do try to make these lessons accessible to the point where they aren't necessary. They're just nice to have if you are someone who likes to work with that sort of thing. I am using them, but you don't have to. I really wanted to stress that. And I also wanted to say a massive thank you to everybody who does support the channel up there. Literally couldn't do this without you. And yeah, you keep the lights on, and it means so much, and I appreciate it so much. So thank you. I know I always kind of get a little tripped up in my words when I talk about it, because it's something I'm very grateful for, and I think it's sometimes a little difficult to express and communicate that, but really big thank you to everybody who does really support the channel that way. But if you can't, again, don't don't worry about it. It's okay. Sometimes I get comments and things saying like, I really want to, but I just can't financially do it. And don't feel bad. Don't feel bad at all if you can. It's only if you can. But back to the painting. I'm going to stop rambling. But thank you. Here I'm just covering up the bottom area with that same dark pigment that we used for the foliage. Up top, I'm using the 1-inch flat-headed brush because it can cover a lot of space, and I am trying to get sharp foliage like applications along the edges, and I just do so with a tapping effect of that brush. We did that so that we could let the top dry, and now that it has dried, I'm going in with the same mixture of the fog, and I'm taking out branches. I'm using next to no water in this process because I want the paint to be as thick as it can be. I will still have to go back and do at least 2 layers, and you can still see the branches through this first layer, which is how you know you'll need to go back and do more layers. Sometimes you'll have to do more than 2, but again, this mixture is, I believe, quite a lot of titanium white, and then whatever that amount is, you grab a 1/12 that in Mars Black, 1/12 that in Ultramarine blue, and you should end up with the same thing or something very, very similar. So here I'm looking at the reference photo and looking at the trace board saying, okay, where do I need to kind of trim down? Where did I get a lot of extra foliage that I don't need? I'm trying to make the tree look less like a myriad of speckles and more so like an actual tree which has clusters of foliage and branches that extend out to different amounts. Also, branches don't just move left and right, they move towards us, and that is important to remember when we are painting this. So do let the middle sections of the foliage also get thick and show through, cover up portions of the actual tree trunk. That is another little thing to consider. But here you can see that I'm really jumping around quite a lot. I'm trying to taper my trees as one of my larger thoughts, I guess. Trying to ensure that they aren't too blocky. I found that when I stepped back that was an issue I was having with these. And I do try to incorporate the troubles that I have sometimes in these lessons so that you also get to think of them, and it's not, oh, he's doing everything just right. No, I also have to think about it. But here's a wider shot just so you can see where we're at. We do need to add a lot of depth to it, and the next step is adding some mid values to our trees. So we're going to do that with a lot of our sap green, about half that in Mars Black, about an equal mixture of titanium white to Mars Black. We're doing the blending with the 1-inch flat-headed brush because of course it does hold the most paint. And then I realized, you know what, that needs to be a lot brighter, so we double up our titanium white. We go in for another test, and that definitely looks a lot better. Still a little bit dark, but I like to build it up. So we will go to our liner brush. We'll grab that pigment, and I'm going to apply this predominantly for the most part on the tops of our markings, and that way it looks like how the light's coming down, it's going to catch the tops of these branches, and then you'll have a subtle gradient going into the darker area of the stroke that is existing on the bottom. It'll create some actual additional depth. It'll colorize the piece a little bit, and this is a really, really great step. It also forces you to look at each individual branch very meticulously. So if there's a particular area that you're not too sure about, you can really investigate it and say, oh, you know what, maybe I want to expand on it. Maybe I want more. Oh, maybe, you know what, I want less. So I'll let it dry. I'll go back in with that mist pigment. So this is a really, really great step for just ensuring that everything is actually exactly how you want it to be. And do remember that your application here is going to be slightly darker than what you actually have on your palette because we are working on top of a Mars Black and it is semi-transparent. You could, and we will to a point, let it dry entirely and then go back and add it again. That way you're building green on top of green rather than green on top of black, and then you do actually get the color that is on your palette. But it's one of those things where you do have to be a bit more patient and build it up. You can again also speed up the process by just making the mixture on your palette a little bit brighter. Therefore it will be brighter than what you have on the reference photo, but you'll get the actual color that there is on the reference photo. I always aim for the color of the reference photo by default because it lets me take smaller steps, as I've noted I appreciate, but it is a way of working a bit more quickly should you want to. Though this lesson is actually quite quick compared to the normal lessons on this channel. It's certainly not the 3 to 4 hour usual, so something a little bit more digestible. Again, it's a bit more of a simple piece visually. There's significantly less happening. There aren't too many elements, but I think that's also something really important to work on. I know that I inherently love working on and tend to gravitate towards photos and pieces that are very expansive. There's a lot going on in every element of it, and I love that. But because I love it so much, throughout my artistic career, now probably 15 years, I find that there are more simple pieces which I struggle with because I want to add more, and actually simplifying it and keeping it simple and just finding the right balance there can be difficult. So I did try to purposefully pick this lesson to interject something that is a bit more compositionally simple. That way we don't as a whole, as a community, move in the same direction that I did there, and you can continue to grow with the proper balance, ensuring that you are confident and happy working on more minimalistic pieces rather than things that are very maximist. Though maximist, a made up word, I should note, before you start using that around your friends, or at least I believe so. And I kept using the word simple where I really should have been using minimalistic. There's nothing wrong with either, but I think that sometimes simple can have a negative connotation in our mind in terms of art. You say, oh, I want to do something great, I want to do something difficult, or realistically, sometimes those very minimal pieces can be absolutely fantastic and really incredible. I think that we all have different personal preferences, and sometimes to some people the more minimal pieces are great. So don't be afraid of the word simple, don't be afraid of minimal pieces, and if you gravitate towards them, that's wonderful. Here today we are really just trying to find the balance, though, and here we have a really close-up shot where you can see just how subtle this green is in comparison to the other, how I am still trying to work on top of it. And I know that this lesson is a little bit different than what we normally do, and that normally it's hyper focused on what we're painting at the time, what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it. I'm still trying to cover those bases, but because there is just so much time spent on the same pieces, it's really nice to have these conversations about painting in general that we normally don't have an opportunity to do. I used to think about making 5 to 10 minute videos on these topics, but now I kind of try to interject them into the lessons here and there, and I feel like this piece in particular has been a great vehicle. That said, here we are doing something different. We are working on the bottom right hand corner with the fan brush, and that same green that we were working on up top, I am trying to define the tops of numerous trees, much like the ones that we have been working on, and these are all in a very large cluster, so they're packed in together for the most part. I want them to be spaced out to a certain point. We are going to fill in the middle areas with additional foliage, but I do want that diversity. Again, some taller than others, some are a bit wider. The spacing should also always be different, and I am not incorporating the same amount of pressure with my brush every time. I'm trying to rotate it differently every time, keeping all of those general ideas, randomization interjected into that to keep it as natural as we can get it. And now at this point, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, essentially 5 of these trees poking up throughout. And once I really start to run out of the pigment on my brush, I'm going to randomly apply a lot of these little tappings throughout so that they blend in to the rest of our trees and the trees don't look too stark or unnatural. I'm not going to be working in the same general directions as the trees. This is going to be much more loose. There are going to be a lot more horizontal-esque applications, and so now you can subtly see those trees poking out, but it isn't going to be too visually overwhelming or compete with what we have in the middle. From there, though, we do need to start working on some something a little bit brighter. So I'm going to grab for the very first time some of our cadmium yellow deep hue. This is by Liquitex Basics. Very first time I think I'm actually using that brand here in this lesson, but I'm using it with some titanium white to create something a little bit brighter. Not a great deal. I still want room to continue making it brighter. I'm testing it both in the trees at the top and in the bottom so that I have option for both. Though I do end up opting for a slightly more yellow mixture, as it really is quite prominent in the bottom. We will still build up to it, but I switch back to the liner brush and we continue doing more of what we were doing with the previous green, and that's heading to the top of each limb, applying it and working it throughout. Though you don't have to apply it to all of the branches. If you feel like one of them is going to have particularly hard shadows from another branch on top, you might want to leave it out there, or you also just might not want to continue to add too much green. You might be happy with the more simple state of it. You already have two different values. You have that light wrapping around it. You have that depth. The more we do of this, hypothetically, the more depth we can add. But sometimes, again, keeping it simple is ideal. And I know that I personally will tend to add more. So something else to consider as you watch me do this, if you actually do want that additional layer and additional color in with your piece. At this point, it really is a rather gray painting. Most of our pigment has either a little bit of a blue or a little bit of a green to it, but it's all very desaturated so that we have a lot of option here in the final stretch of it. Though I'm going to move over to the left-hand side tree, and this is actually quite interesting because you can see that not all of the brush strokes move particularly downwards on a bit of an angle. Sometimes they also move up, and they move in all of these unique directions because branches don't just go down. Sometimes they do find themselves kind of having a bit of a curl and overlap with other ones, moving up once you get to a portion that isn't too thick that it has too much weight that kind of drags it back down with foliage, right? Some branches are just going to be heavier than others for that reason. So we're trying to keep that in our general, mindset as we go ahead and paint this. And here I'm continuing to try to keep the darker pigment still showing through. We are also going to have branches that move out behind the tree, right? And those aren't going to have any highlights at all because the light is coming down on them, and then we simply see the back/bottom of it. So that is something I'm trying to stay mindful of and ensure we still do keep some that are simply just silhouetted, particularly that are facing the back. So it could also be forward facing. It really is up to you depending upon what you initially wanted to do with that silhouetted application that is close to the trunk of the tree. But with that, I think that it's actually going really, really well. I like how subtle it is, but the fact that we do now have more coloring, it certainly has more color than the middle ground and background, which does deliver depth. Normally, you get more saturation as you move towards the foreground, and so it's just another great little addition. Though we will be taking this pigment and adding it to the bottom trees as well. I'm going to try to cover, I'll start by covering the trees that do point up that we initially worked in there. Not going to cover the entirety of those applications, and I am using the fan brush, so it's relatively random. Doing so would be very difficult, though I don't want to anyway. And I'm going to continue with the same application idea that I did with our darker green, in that we begin with our general trees, and they probably end up looking a little awkward because they don't really blend into anything. But eventually, when I do actually start to run out of paint here, then we go in with that tapping effect and fill out the other general areas. And if you do end up doing too much here, don't worry about it. We can work reductively as well. We can go back, we can make it darker, and I will show you how to do that a little bit later in the lesson. But right now, we are trying to fill it out with some nice green foliage. This is going to be a bit more opaque in application, and I do want it to be slightly brighter than what we have with the larger trees because it is closer to us. I wanted to have slightly more saturation, follow those general rules, and the closer we get to us, the less layers of mist that a subject can have over it. So the more innate natural coloring you can actually see in that mixture. So here, going in with something again a little bit brighter, continuing to build it up, and I feel like we're starting to get to a level of density which does look natural, which I'm really happy about. The trees continuing to look different from those next to them, very randomized at this point. You could always go in with a liner brush if you feel like you need to add some additional consistency or flow to it, like we did with the 3 primary trees, but I'm actually quite happy with what we're getting done here with the liner. So I think from there, I'll take the majority of the paint off my brush, as you can see on the side of my palette, and then I'll go in for that tapping effect, which we previously did. I'm not really trying to aim for the previously tapped applications. If we get different areas, that's a-okay, though I do still want those really dark areas to still show through to a point, so we get a lot of different layers, and the closer we get to it, the more layers we should ultimately see in the painting. Though I do think I overdid the amount of brightness in this bottom spot, so we will be going back in darkening portions. And from there, we are going to be switching to our second fan brush. The first one we used had a soft bristle, but this one here has a harder bristle. So when it has paint or water, the bristles aren't going to condense together to create 5 to 10 clumps. Instead, they're all going to stay sharp and randomized, which is great because it's going to allow us to render dozens of little implications with individual taps. So from there, I'm going to create a bit of a brighter mixture, significantly more yellow than what we had before. And at this point, I would say more than half of the mixture is that cadmium yellow deep hue. And once I get that mixed with the larger brush, we are going to head back in with the new fan brush and start delivering those extra details via subtle taps, applying next to no pressure. Really don't want the bristles dragging on the canvas. I essentially want to tap paint to canvas and then remove the brush and do it again. But this is great because it is going to add a lot of extra detail to these trees. And I do start with the predominant ones that do stick up more vertically. I like to begin with that vertical stroke actually, and then I move into more of the diagonal horizontal applications that are therefore more of the branches. But once we have these implemented, the larger bodies, we also take the pigment and start to work it into the negative space, just like we did with everything else, continuing to even it all out, because now we definitely couldn't just leave this on the other trees. Otherwise they would have a different value, but also a different application texture. So they just stand out far, far too much. And while we do end up making this too bright and too green, we do work reductively very, very soon and kind of balance it all out. So in no way am I worried, and in no way should you be worried, especially here at this point, because we're doing really well and we can work backwards if we need to. One of the wonderful things about acrylics. But speaking of working reductively, we are going to grab a lot of that Mars black, maybe about 1/3 that in sap green, maybe 1/8, 1/10 that in titanium white, make that really dark mixture, go back to our nice more firm fan brush, and now we'll start working this texture, this darker shadow back into those trees and that area down there. Start trying to break up the areas got a little bit too green, a little bit too dense. We do want that contrast of the multiple greens and that darker background. That's what's going to give it a lot of depth. And I also want to start taking away a little bit of the form, because I felt like our trees were very visually evident, and we can kind of break them in half. We can make them less tall. We can just separate the greens in the middle. And I think this right here really helped make it look significantly more natural. And I'm really personally happy with it. So I'd suggest that you might also want to add a little bit of that darker pigment to the right hand corner specifically, give the painting a bit more of a vignetted look so that the eye works its way more towards the center of the piece. And here we are going over to our liner brush for some details. A lot of titanium white, a lot of our cadmium yellow, still a bit of our green Mars black, all of that good stuff. But we are going for the brightest pigment that we have worked with yet, yet. And we're going to tap in some individual little details to create the form that we really want for our protruding trees down here in the bottom right area. I'm not going to go overboard, but remember, as we get closer to us in the foreground, we are moving through less and less layers of fog. We are getting more of that natural innate saturation, that natural color, so we can have things that are a bit more vibrant like this. And it separates this area from the three primary trees, which is also really, really nice. We did the majority of this area with two different fan brushes. Here now we are using this individual, very purposeful brush, and it's all coming together. We got that randomization that we needed, and now we can put in that intentional thought, intentional application, which will bring it all together, make it look neat and tidy, and also give us some really uniquely interesting trees. Like truly, we have all of these different applications, and they're coming together to make something great. I noted 100 times at the start of the lesson that we were going to go through a lot of awkward phases, and I use the idea all the time that building an acrylic painting is a lot like building a house. You start with this really awkward looking hole in the ground, and then you add this really awkward looking foundation, and you keep adding, and you add, and you add, and you add, and eventually you can have this beautiful fully furnished home. But it takes all of this layering essentially, and that's what we're doing here with our acrylic painting, with our trees, with all of the mist and the fog and all of that. So it's something that gets me really excited when you can kind of visualize it and work towards it. And it's why I did stress so much throughout this, that it's okay if something's not working. It's probably because at this point it's not meant to look great, and we will get there. And here we can see things coming to fruition, starting to look really, really nice. And I love that we're here. I love that we have a community here that stays to watch these really long lessons. Again, this one isn't nearly as long as the majority of them, but hey, if you made it this far, thank you for being a part of the community. Thank you for your interest in traditional art. I think in a time where digital art is so prominent, it's really nice to know that people are still interested in working with the tangible. I love digital art. I love working on it myself, but I also still love painting, and I think it's wonderful that you're here for that painting process. And I thank you for just being a part of that dedicated community. Again, I'd like to say a really, really big thank you to everybody who supports the channel directly up over on Patreon. If it wasn't for you, I'd probably have to make 4 to 6 minute long sped up painting videos that do really well in like the YouTube system. But I don't have to do that. I don't have to pander to views. I can make what I feel really inspires me, and I can make these long, very informative videos, and I can only do that because of you and the community support. So thank you for making that happen. Again, if you are new to the channel and you haven't heard of me talk about it before, like I guess I did say earlier in the lesson, if you would like the ebooks, the traceables, the reference photos, access to our exclusive Facebook group, all of that good stuff, link is in the description to the Patreon. Great way of supporting the channel. Always very much appreciated. But if you can't do it, don't worry about it at all. It's wonderful that you're just here, that you are partaking in the lesson, that you're this far. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. I try to get these out. I used to say every week. Right now it's every other week, but I do have a second series I'm kind of working on in the background that will make it every week again, trying out some different things, working through different mediums and whatnot to kind of find the perfect way of teaching it. But we do have very exciting things coming soon, and I can't wait to share them with you. I feel like we have a lot of great creative projects. Though I recognize I have been talking about not the painting for a little while. Right now we are doing the final touch-ups. Those are going to look different for just about everyone. For some of us, it's going to be removing some of the foliage. Right now I'm going in and I'm adding in more. It might be adding some extra bright areas to the 3 trees in the middle. It might be darkening some of them, adding in some extra branches. there are so many little things we could be doing. You could be adding more fog to some of the trees in the background if you'd like. The ones in the top right hand corner I find are relatively prevalent, but I actually really liked that. Initially I was thinking about covering them up with a soft layer of fog, but I really don't feel like we need to. I feel like it's a great natural leading line. But that right there is essentially the painting. So big thank you to you again for sticking around. Normally, as we get towards the end, I like to give a little keyword, something you can incorporate in your comments, so I and everybody else knows that you made it this far. You are one of the dedicated few. And I think today we'll just go with the word Misty. It is a very misty scene. We painted quite a bit of it. And I think that it'll be easy enough to work into a sentence, but it's this very subtle way of saying, hey, I made it to the end. And it's always really fun to see who did that and who does that continuously. So I can't wait to see all of the comments and, you know, just have those conversations. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the community. I will see you soon with a brand new painting lesson and a brand new series, which I'm very excited about. So see you soon. Take care, stay well. Don't forget to stay hydrated while you're painting, and stay creative.